Hey guys, welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel, which is now going to be the joint Hybrid Athlete Nexus Athlete Hub channel. I'm trying to condense all of my business and personal YouTube onto one platform eventually. Anyway, so I have got another YouTube set up for the Nexus Athlete Hub, but at the moment that's just got information, some of the live sessions and some of the programs that we've got for our online membership. So if you are interested in coaching, online coaching, performance coaching for a wide range of sports, please go to our web address down there, www.bebetter.info. I'll link it in the description so that you can check out what we've got on offer in terms of nutrition coaching and performance coaching, all in one membership space at an affordable price. Right, plug over, next plug, like and subscribe if you get any use out of this video. So today we are here to answer a client of mine's question who is also a coach, which was based around this idea of what do we do if we're working with an athlete, maybe we're a bit time limited, what do we do to program to get as much out of each session as we possibly can, or in your own training, how do we program to get as much out of each session as we possibly can? So this might be useful for, say, maybe combat sports athletes, or maybe people who are sort of runners and athletes who are trying to do a bit of strength and conditioning work in and around their running, or the cycling endurance athletes, sorry, that's what I was trying to say. They're trying to fit those things in and around and trying to get as much as they can that adds value into a 1 hour session without really needing to nail down and specialize in one particular area. So I've come up with these sort of 5 principles to follow. Now, before I get into this, what I would say is that of these principles, at times, there will, with most things, if they think of things of like a sliding scale of performance, there's sometimes where you can get away with training opposites and there's certain methodologies you can employ, but then at some point there might be some contradiction, there might be some ideas that kind of butt up against each other. So think of these as principles, not exclusive rules to program your training life by, because there will always be exceptions to these rules. Number 1, if you are under time constraints, don't waste your warm-ups. If there's something that you are poor at, for example, if you don't do much plyometric or ballistic work, incorporate some base plyometric exercises or ballistic exercises, sort of, little hops, bounds, leaps, change of direction work, maybe some, like dumbbell jumps, things that aren't really high load plyometrics, but things that you can incorporate into your warm-ups, ladder drills, things like that, which are going to create a good base for plyometric work either later on within the session, or if you don't do much plyometric work and you want to really improve your power, then your rate of force development, then including that into warm-ups. But other things like, people have got mobility issues, core issues, any of those muscles around the kind of hips where there's a lack of stability there, all of those things can be incorporated into warm-ups, and built in gradually, but then done quite aggressively. So there can be some training benefit in those things. So don't waste your warm-ups, just doing 5 minutes on a bike or whatever, or 10 minutes on a bike. Yeah, there might be an element of getting your heart rate up, but you want to do that in a way which allows you to at least potentially facilitate some basic progressions in some of the limitations that we might have or someone else might have if we're coaching an athlete. Number 2 is prioritize your fatigue. Now, we might want to tick many training boxes, and there are always going to be limits on this, okay? We can't just say we're going to train everything in one session. If you think about the whole plethora of performance adaptations that we might try and target, everything from peak strength right the way through to, long, slow endurance, aerobic endurance type work, we can't do all of that in one session. But if we're talking about an hour in the gym S&C session, prioritize in order of importance the thing that you want to focus on most, but also be aware of the carryover that might have. So for example, let's say I want to do a strength and power session. That's fine, but depending on how I order the power or the strength might depend on how much effort I'm going to put into that strength training. So if I'm going to go and I'm going to do 5 or 6 really heavy sets of squats, am I really then going to be able to go and really work on my power development? Probably not. Whereas I might be able to do my power development first, and with enough rest, it's not going to carry over into the strength. But depending on the type of power training you're doing, it might. So we can still train multiple facets within the same endish of the spectrum. So, like strength, resistance exercise, power at one end of the spectrum, but we just need to prioritize. We just need to order how we're going to handle that fatigue. So things like if you're going to do any muscular endurance work, or intervals on a bike or a run, you're probably going to want to do those sort of things at the end of a session once you've got your sort of strength and power work out the way with at the start, because you want those two things to be done in as unfatigued state as possible. Why? Because we want to be able to move with intent, we want to be able to move safely, and we want to be able to really maximize the amount of force that we can put through our bodies or the bar or whatever it is that we're moving when we're focused about generating maximum forces, or we're trying to generate forces at maximum velocities with whatever we are using to develop power. Okay, point number 3 is surf the curve. Now, the force velocity curve is actually a force velocity line for multi-joint movements, but you'll hear it referred to as the force velocity curve. If you don't know what this is, I would give it a do a bit of digging and research, and actually I might do a sports science shorts on the force velocity curve and what it tells us, and a few little bits about biomechanics and things as well. In fact, that's what I'm going to do. I need some inspiration for content, so that's what I'm going to do towards the end of the week. So I'll go into this in a little bit more detail and then try and edit it back into this video. But if we think about this force velocity curve, basically what it says is this: the heavier the load, the slower the velocity will be to move it. So if we're thinking about maximum strength work, because we're overcoming the resistance and gravity in a lot of movements, we are going to be moving with very slow contraction velocities, okay? So on that force velocity curve, we're likely going to want to have to tick a lot of boxes as we come down from that very slow velocity, high load, high force generating component, all the way down to high velocity, low load movements as well. So that would be the plyometrics up to strength. Now you can, like I said before, we can adjust how we do these things in terms of order of priority of fatigue, but it's also important, I think, to make sure that we're doing 2 or 3 sets at some point across the curve, dependent on which, if it's lower body power, upper body power, or both, and I'll come on to that in a second about how we might do that. It's important that if we're going to tick all the boxes, think about those slow, medium, and fast velocities. Your slow velocities are going to be maximum strength. Your medium velocities are likely to be roughly where your sort of peak power is going to be developed, and the lower end velocities are going to be where your dynamic, explosive rate of force development, that's the term I was after, how quickly we can produce force is going to be developed there. And in terms of doing that as well, that's things like, sprinting, body weight jumps and things in that area. So we can do these things in a multimodal sport with running, as long as we then think about the velocities. So not let's talk about resistance training here. We might be doing sprint work with an athlete, for example, if it was like a rugby athlete, or even trying to get them to just do some intervals and things. Yes, you're going to want them sprinting maximally and under recovering for that force generation and power, but also it might improve their speed. So be aware, if we're going to try and train multiple components of fitness, that the adaptations that we're trying to elicit are along this curve. So if we're trying to tick the boxes in this curve, so it's not something that you need to necessarily use something. So I use Output Sports to measure velocities. God, how many water bottles over there? Output Sports to measure velocities at outputs across different loads, so that I can make sure that I'm looking at. I've done a thing on velocity-based training as well. I'll link a video on that. But yeah, like, you don't need to necessarily use a piece of equipment like that. What you can do though is just through observation, and you can then take a movement that looks fairly similar and then build up through the load on that in order to work along that curve or line, as it were. So yeah, think about that. And then doesn't necessarily mean you're going to distribute necessarily your sets or how many exercises you do across the curve evenly. But what you might do is, at different times of the competition year, if you're having to tick multiple boxes, is that curve, the end at which you distribute your training, the fast or slow velocity movements, the high or low loading movements. You across the course of the competition year, you are gonna somewhat periodize that, even if you can't fully periodize. I really like cluster sets for if I'm looking at strength and power development, particularly at that kind of peak power, sort of power against resistance type adaptation. So, things like in rugby tackling drills, things like that, generating power for fighters. I really like cluster sets. Cluster sets, basically what you do is take a conventional set. So for example here, if you were to do, say, 3 sets of 5 with 180 seconds rest in between sets, that's 360 seconds of total rest. You could do 15 single repetitions with 25 seconds rest in between each repetition, which totals 360 seconds. Now, this isn't always the most practical thing to do, having someone rack and unrack, let's say with a squat. It might work with a hex deadlift or a bench press, for example. But you can do smaller clusters, so you could do doubles or triples and just break down the rest as you see, the rest periods as you see fit. Well, why is this useful? Well, we can use it in one of two ways. One is because we're resting between reps, we can still use the same amount of weight as we could do for 3x5, but we're going to maintain a higher velocity on that because we're not creating fatigue across the set. We're getting that rest, so it allows us to maintain a higher power output at the same load. Okay. And then again, the last few reps you might start to dip off. So that means we're probably likely to get some kind of hypertrophy strength benefit, but the earlier sets are going to be more that kind of pure peak power loading as well. It also, what it means is that we potentially, if we're more focused on probably more muscle hypertrophy and pure strength development, again, we still need to be selective how we use the clusters. What we can then do is we can actually, because we're resting between these little clusters of sets, we can actually use a heavier load for those full 15 repetitions than we would do if we were to do it the 5 reps. Your percentage at which you can maintain is usually a little bit higher. So it allows us to develop a lot of volume in strength training and a lot of volume in our power training quickly by mitigating fatigue, by redistributing those rest periods. And that's something I use a lot in my kind of my initial volume strength blocks at the start of a program. So I'm having a recovery block at the moment. The first few weeks I go back into in my strength block, I use a lot of cluster sets for the strength, power and hypertrophy benefits, because you can get a lot of work done in a very short period of time. Which brings me on to point number 5, which is pair up your movements. So we talked about cluster sets before. There's no reason why you couldn't do a bench press and a hex deadlift on a cluster set. Obviously, you would still redistribute the rest between both exercises. So you might go for 50 seconds. But what you can do is, because you're using opposite ends of the body, as it were, you're not going to accumulate that much fatigue. So you can bring your rest periods down a little bit shorter. So you can pair up cluster sets, and I've done this quite effectively. You can also pair up cluster sets, for example, with, you might say, do a bench press with 25 seconds rest, but after the bench press, you might do some lower body explosive work. Okay. You can also do opposite muscle groups with this as well. That's kind of what I was talking about with the cluster set. So we might say, even if I was doing a pure strength session, I might do a set of 5 hex deadlifts into a set of 5 overhead press. Okay. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of fatigue carryover, but we might then not do, let's say we did the hex deadlift into overhead press, we might use the overhead press as more of a muscular endurance component for that movement, as long as we've done the strength work that we need to do. Or maybe we're just prioritizing muscular endurance in the upper body, and in the lower body we want more strength. So again, we need to understand where our athlete is on the spectrum, or where we are on the spectrum of the things we're going to want to focus on, because we're not going to be able to target everything all the time, but we can still be able to get a little bit of one thing done whilst focusing on the other if we're clever about how we pair these movements up. And like I said before, we can do things opposite end of the curve. So we can use a cluster set with a high load and a low load. We can use cluster sets with 2 high loads, or we can use what I would call a lot of A's and B's. So if I was doing, let's say, plyometric work with an athlete, I could say on one end, I'll do a lower body plyometric movement with an upper body plyometric movement, and I'll go from one straight into the other and keep the rest period the same. All of these things interlink with each other. And this is what I think is an important thing to think about coaching and programming, is the principles remain roughly the same, but we do have to be creative in how we use those principles, and that's what makes good coaching. And being creative in coaching is important. What we do need to be careful of, though, is that doesn't matter how clever our programming is, we still have to prioritize at a certain level, so we don't just end up not getting enough stimulus to create the specific adaptation. So if we think about strength and power, and I've talked about that a lot, but it tends to be more plyometric-y, power-y, strength-y type stuff, but it tends to be a lot more what you would do in a classic S&C environment. You need to be aware that if you think about the 3x5 rule, 3 sets of 5, that tends to apply for strength and power. So you don't need to be doing lots of sets on each movement to tick those boxes. So you still need to prioritize. Now, obviously then when you start throwing things into the mix like endurance work, it becomes incredibly difficult. And that's where hopefully if you've only got an athlete for say an hour a week of responsibility on them or their other coaches, fight coaches, rugby coaches, depending on what they're doing in their sessions, to be doing most of the base training building, they'll be doing runs and things as well. If you had someone in for an hour a week and it was like a general population client, that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. You probably want to break down your sessions where you have like, your mobility warm-up-y type stuff, a little bit of introduction to plyometrics, probably not introduce too much plyometrics in the main session, but be doing peak power and strength work and hypertrophy work if it's an aesthetic thing. And then 15-20 minutes at the end is when, if they're capable of doing it, you probably want to bring in just some high intensity interval training work. Not that that's going to elicit loads of fat loss for a client if it was general population or a transformation coach, but if we're looking at hitting the fundamental components of fitness, we know we're going to get a lot of aerobic benefits from doing high intensity work, which gives us that edge. But obviously high intensity work is quite hard and we can't just do loads of it all the time if someone's not conditioned to it. So again, it's understanding your client, understanding your athlete, and figuring how do I get the most bang for my buck out of those sessions. But what I would say is that there are definitely ways that you can, you might not be able to maximize strength on a program where you're trying to tick many boxes, but you can certainly improve strength and improve power. And then once people get to a certain level, particularly if it's yourself or athletes and you've got your foundations in place, then we just shift that dial or that mixing desk so that, we turn down the power work and turn up the strength work, or we turn down the strength work and turn up the power work. How would we know to do that? Well, we test and we look for things like the dynamic strength index, the reactive strength index. We look for where we're weak on our curve as well. So when I talk about testing athletes, that's why it's important. And that's why I use the Output Sports, because it allows me to see where my athlete sits on that curve to say, look, do we need to develop more strength to be able to access more rate of force development? Is the athlete super powerful, but his maximum strength isn't there? So we need to drag that end up a little bit so that, if we need to produce force within a sporting context, we've got those gears to go through there as well. Anyway, guys, hopefully that's been useful. Please give this a like and a subscribe. Please check out the website and my business Instagram, which is the Nexus Athlete Hub, which is down there somewhere. And obviously on Facebook as well. So please, if you could give those pages a like, that would be awesome. And check out my programs. Any questions or anything, as always, post comments below, and I will put a link to everything in my description. For now, guys, have a great rest of the week, and I will speak to you all very soon, where I will come back and I am going to talk about some basic biomechanics principles for strength training. So how the biomechanics variables link to each other, and then we'll look at some of those force velocity curves and some of the velocity power curves and force power curves and stuff as well. And we'll link that all together nicely so this makes more sense. And on that note, guys, peace.